Hello and welcome back to Rosie Sews Modern Vintage. I'm Rosie and it is really lovely to have you here today. Now, I put out a little call on Instagram a couple of weeks ago for some feedback as to any questions that you might like to ask me. So I've had a few responses, so I thought we would talk about that today. I was so relieved when I actually got some questions through from people, because I had this awful idea that I was going to say, has anybody got any questions they want to ask me? And then I wouldn't actually get a response, and that I would just be Billy No Mates sitting there waiting for another message and I didn't get one. So I'm really grateful to everybody that posted questions, and I will try and cover as many of them as I can today. I just also want to say I've got the most glamorous finger today because I cut my finger and I only had blue plasters left, so I apologise. So my first question comes from Hagar Hagadashery on Instagram, and she said, what are your favourite and least favourite vintage eras? Now, this is a great question. I love it because it's so interesting to hear what different people like the most out of vintage eras. And for me, the thing that very first attracted me to vintage clothes was the style from the 1950s, the big swing skirts, the big petticoats, all that kind of thing. And it was just so pretty and so elegant that I really fell in love with it. But then as I've got more and more into my vintage style, I've also fallen in love with the 1930s. Although 30s and 40s style was quite similar, in the 30s there were it was just that touch more feminine, so softer prints, softer colours, softer silhouettes. By the 40s, although they were still doing florals and pretty clothes, there was a lot of shoulder pads and a lot of sort of very angular clothes, and for me that is really what I love to wear because I don't think it really suits me. I prefer to go for a softer shape. So for me, it's the 1930s and the 1950s that are my favourite. And she also asked me what was my least favourite decade. Now, I hate to be negative about any decade because, of course, everything's got something lovely about it. But fashion from the 70s just does not appeal to me. Even the late 60s, really. Early 60s I really like, but late 60s I'm not keen. And then once you get to the 1980s, the one thing I like about the 80s is they did pinch a lot of styles from the 40s. So if you look at a dress or a hat on eBay, it would be easy to mistake it for a 1940s dress, whereas in actual fact it is from the 80s. So in that respect I do like 80s fashion, but I'd rather go for the original in the 40s. Yeah, and then 90s, well, what can I say? I think it's better not to discuss the 90s because I'm really not a fan, even though at the time I was wearing it all and loved it. Now, not so much. But, you know, we all have to make those fashion mistakes, don't we, to realise what our true style is. Jane is next from Loopy Mabel's Closet, and she asked me, how do you style your hair in vintage styles? So I think vintage hairstyling can be quite overwhelming to start with because it looks all so complicated, and that people who do their hair in a vintage style must be so clever and talented. And I do still think that's true because I've got so much to learn. Like today's style is not great because I did take the dog out for a walk, so it's got rather windswept, and I need to do my roots, as you can tell. But the real secret to be able to do your hair in a vintage style is just to stalk people on Instagram and YouTube. Follow as many Instagram accounts and YouTube channels as you can, and just watch. And then when you've watched stuff, practice it, practice. I've been doing my hair in vintage styles on and off for about 5 years, and I would say it's really only this year that I've started to feel like some of the stuff I do looks good. I mean, I get the occasional good hair day, but I feel like I properly know what I'm doing with a lot of the stuff that I didn't really know before. So definitely practice is what's key. There's some particularly good people on Instagram and YouTube, and I'm going to recommend some of those. So on Instagram, the delightful Mrs. B, She's just started to do hair tutorials. She's only done 2 up until filming this, but they are really good and they talk you through the process really easily. Death by Deco, she does some amazing tutorials and shows you how to incorporate scarves and all sorts of things to make them look really beautiful. And also another lady called Ginger Lou, and her, if you flick over from your photograph feed to the video feed, IGTV, that's where they post all their videos. And Ginger Lou has got some brilliant tutorials on how to do various vintage hairstyles, barrel rolls and like Betty bangs at the front and all that kind of thing. So really fantastic. And then on YouTube, there's some people that I really love following on there. Natalie at Fitfully Vintage. She's such a nice lady, and she does lots of really super simple styles to copy. They look really impressive, but they're simple to achieve. She's fantastic, I think, for you to sort of, for your maybe first dip into vintage hairstyling. I also really like A Vintage Vanity. She's totally nuts, that lady, but so gorgeous and adorable. I really enjoy watching her channel, and she does lots of good hairstyling advice. Rachel Maxey, she's very into being historically correct, which is really nice to know that you're actually doing something that would have been seen in the era that you're trying to replicate. And she's also a makeup artist, so she does some really good makeup tutorials as well. Miss B Town is great. And then finally, a channel called Glamour Days. Now, the slight different thing with Glamour Days is that they, the person that runs this channel, I don't know their name, I don't know what they look like, because all they do is they post original videos from the 40s, 50s, 60s with beauty advice. So you're getting the real advice from back in that decade. Now, it's quite hilarious and sometimes quite offensive, the things that they say. So they might, it's always a man, normally a man doing a tutorial, because of course men had to tell women how to dress in those days, and he normally says, you know, a man likes to see this and a man likes to see that, or when your husband gets home you should look like this, and things like that, which is really winds me up. But the actual style ideas are really helpful. So for instance, there was a 1940s tutorial on how to do blusher. Now, that even something as simple as blusher changed over the decades. So in the 20s, the blusher was very much sort of on the ball of the apple of the cheek and just done in sort of a nicely blended circle. In the 40s, it was put on the apple of the cheek and then it was drawn in like a triangle and then blended. So even those little things you can get if you want to from watching tutorials. Next question was from Liz, the baker that sews, and she asked, what is your favourite pattern company and why? Now, this is a really hard question because I have so many favourites, and it also depends on the outfit that I'm trying to create. If I want to do a true vintage outfit, I mean, when I say true vintage, when I want to really sort of go to town and look proper 40s, 50s, etc., I think the companies that I like the best are Sew La Di Da, Till the Sun Goes Down, Sew Over It, and Gertie Hirsch. Her books are fantastic. She also had some amazing patterns under her label Charm Patterns, and also some from Simplicity and Butterick. But it's her books that I find the best, particularly her book on jiffy dresses. Axed look, a bit more of a granny chic look, you know, with smocks and apron dresses and things like that. I really like Sew Me Something, Tilly and the Buttons, and oh, I've forgotten what the other one was now. Oh yes, from Simplicity, the range of dresses by Dottie Angel. So they're the Simplicity ones, and I just love them all, and it just depends on what mood I'm in as to when I want to use them. The next question is from Karen, who is Vintage Mrs P, and she says, do you use vintage patterns? Now, the short answer to that is no. And the only reason why the answer is no is because it is incredibly hard to get anything my size. So vintage patterns were only sold in single sizes normally, or perhaps in 2 or 3, but not in a vast range of sizes like they are today. Obviously they're like 70, 80 years old, so they're really hard to come by. Plus, people weren't that big in those days. So for me, being plus size 18 to 20, well, yeah, 18, it's very, very difficult to find a vintage pattern. So I think I've got two. One of them is late 50s. I'll pop a picture up here. The pencil dress and jacket, which is my size, and I am planning to make that soon. And the other one is actually from the 80s, but it has a style of pencil skirt that was very typical of the 40s, like I was saying to you earlier. And the pencil skirts that you can get today are lovely, but they're generally very narrow, which I really like. They're very elegant, but sometimes if I want to go for a true vintage look, I want a slightly different silhouette. So I bought this pattern from the 80s that I can recreate that look with. And so Karen then asked also, do you ever hack modern patterns? Well, I do use modern patterns most of the time. I find that if I'm researching a particular look that I want to create, I can generally find a pattern that's created, like a modern pattern, that I can tweak by perhaps just using the right fabric and the right notions. You know, it's incredible what an edging of rickrack can do for a modern skirt. So we take it back a few decades. And then obviously once it's made, then just the way I do my hair, the handbag, the shoes that I wear, that kind of thing, that can turn it into a more vintage looking outfit. And Karen finally asked me, have you always liked vintage clothes? And the answer to that is no. As I mentioned earlier, I was definitely into my fashion when I was during the 90s. And it wasn't really till I turned 30 and I had my daughter that I even thought about it. I got a lot of postnatal depression, and I was left with something called dysmorphia, where I couldn't really look at myself. I just hated looking at myself. I thought I was really ugly. It didn't matter how thin or fat I was, I just hated it. And going into changing rooms in shops and things was just my worst nightmare. Luckily I've come past that now and I'm not so bad, but somebody sort of recommended to me that maybe I wanted to try the kind of 1950s style because it was so elegant and ladylike. And once I discovered it, it was like my eyes were open. I just thought, this is the look. I finally found something that I really want to wear and the way I want to dress, and I know now what my style is, kind of thing. And so that was a really big moment for me, because before I'd always felt that I just bought what I liked in the next sale or something that I saw in New Look's window that I thought was pretty, and that's fine. You know, a lot of people dress like that and that's fine, but when I discovered my style, it did make me feel really good. So yeah, I've been dressing vintage for probably about 12 years, but really seriously, especially sewing on my clothes and stuff like that, probably the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 4, been really serious about it. So it's been a sort of evolving hobby and interest over the years. Patterson Pages asked me, do you find vintage clothes comfortable? Which is a brilliant question, because obviously 30s, 40s, 50s, there wasn't, unless you knitted or crocheted something, there wasn't a lot of jersey around. And women were also still wearing girdles and corsets and things like that. So I think if you're somebody who really enjoys wearing hoodies and jogging bottoms and leggings and that kind of thing, then I think you would find vintage clothes uncomfortable. But for me, because I've been somebody who's always liked to wear, you know, a lot of tailoring and shirts and jackets and smart trousers and skirts and things, I don't find vintage clothes particularly uncomfortable. I do normally wear a waist cincher or a girdle, and it's just like second nature to me now, so I don't find it uncomfortable unless it's a hot day, and then it's really horrible. So when I really want to slob out, when I'm having maybe a bad pain day or a day where I just really can't be bothered to make an effort, then I do reach for the stretchy stuff. And that is actually where dresses like my Tilly and the Buttons dress that I posted on Instagram a few weeks ago really come into their own, because I still feel really nice even though I'm wearing something that's essentially just a sweatshirt. So that is something that I do like. I think the other thing to remember is the types of fabrics. So I had an interesting conversation with Sarah at Olive Road. She sells beautiful vintage fabrics, and she was saying about how she likes to choose vintage jerseys and also the thinner cottons. And I think she's absolutely right. You know, a cotton lawn is so fine and so comfortable in hot weather. Something like that is a beautiful thing to sew with. And I also really like working, if I'm working with a modern fabric, I like a stretch woven. So you can often get cottons that have like 3% elastane in them, and then they've just got that bit of stretch. So even though you're looking smart and tailored, you've just got a bit of comfort in that as well. Crafting at Rutland asked, where do you find your vintage notions and haberdashery, especially during lockdown? Well, to be honest, my shopping for these kind of things hasn't changed an awful lot since lockdown, because unless you find this most amazing, exciting stash in a corner of a charity shop somewhere, or you go to maybe a vintage fair, there's not really anywhere else that you can guarantee finding them unless you look online. So a few of the sellers that I've ordered from, who are on Instagram, are A Bit Button Jeff, Anchors Away Vintage, Olive Road London, and Alice Brown's Cupboard. And they all sell really, oh, and miss one off, the Swagman's Daughter as well. They all sell really lovely vintage haberdashery and all sorts of other treasures as well. And I find that really they're not any more expensive than buying brand new buttons or lace or bias binding or anything. It's about the same price, if not sometimes cheaper. And to know that you've got your buttons and they've not ever been touched since they were produced in the 1940s, I think is just so exciting. It makes me feel really happy, and to include them in my clothes it feels like such a privilege, really. So and of course also it's an environmentally friendly kind of decision as well, because we're not adding to the production. So yeah, those are the people that I like to shop with. And my final question was from Gemma at the Hammy Dressmaker, and she said, can you recommend a visual book or way to see vintage outfits through the decade? I don't really have any books of that kind. I did get a book out of the library which was the history of Christian Dior, and of course he was the person who invented the circle skirt, the new look, in 1949. So it was a very exciting period in fashion, and I did really enjoy reading that book, but I haven't, other than that, really looked at any books. The place where I go to do all my research is Pinterest, and I find that if you want to sort of get an idea of, I don't know, say you've got some red stripy fabric and you want to make a 1940s style skirt, if you put in red stripy 1940s skirt, you're going to get loads of images from that time period, with ideas of, you know, how it would have been made at the time, how it would have been styled. You might even see some sewing patterns as well, all sorts of things that can help you with your kind of history research. So if you wanted to have a look on my Pinterest boards, I mean, I'm no expert, but I have got boards that I accrue all of my information, gather it all in, then please do look out for me. I'll put my link at the bottom in the description below, so please do feel free to check out my Pinterest board. Well, that is everything from me today. Thank you so much to everybody who contributed questions. I was, like I said to you, I was so worried that nobody's going to ask me anything, so I'm really grateful that you did, and I hope that it has explained a little bit about what inspires me and things that I enjoy doing, and I will look forward to seeing you again very soon for another video. In the meantime, happy sewing. Bye.